Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to another historian's interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is an historian making their official debut here on the show. Now, this story in particular, very, very interesting story. One I'm very, very excited to share with you on the show. Now, my guest today has been tattooing since 1991 and opened Daredevil in 1997, literally a year after I was born, when tattooing became legalized in New York City. And Daredevil is not only a tattoo shop, but it is also a museum on tattoo history located on the Lower East Side. And I'm so excited to talk to this guest about the history of tattoos because I know next to nothing about the history of tattoos or the significance of certain designs and so forth and everything. And in addition, my guest today is also going to be talking about her book that she wrote about tattooing. So without further ado, let us give a huge round of applause for our guest today, joining us all the way from New York City, another New York historian, Michelle Myles. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem, Michelle. No problem. I am so excited to have you here on the show, talk to you about your background as a historian and a tattooer, as well as your book. And speaking of your book, do you have a copy that you can show our viewers and listeners?
I do. Oh, it matches my shirt, looks like. It's called Liberty, the Tattooed Lady, and it was basically the catalog for a art show of the same name that I curated at the City Reliquary Museum in New York City.
Nice, nice. So is the book more of like, what's the word? Almost like an art piece about like the certain designs and styles that were on display?
Well, we kind of the art show was about Lady Liberty as she's been represented in tattooing, going back to pretty much ever since she was introduced in our harbor. And
Wow.
so it's mostly like a lot of like vintage tattoo flash that
Whoa.
borrowed artwork from like different collectors around the country, and so we just put them all together and kind of showed how she's been a part of tattooing since she's been in our harbor. So it's got like antique tattoo flash and antique photographs of old tattooers with Lady Liberty tattoos. And I'm just like, I think my passion is sort of almost equally divided between New York City history and tattoo history, and so this kind of like brings the two together. And it was a really fun project.
Awesome. Awesome, Michelle. Well, I'm so excited to talk to you about that because, again, I know next to nothing about the history of tattoos. So
You know,
I'm very
tat-
excited.
you don't have any tattoos?
No, I do not.
Okay, all right.
I've thought about one, but I've never found the right design. I've never found the right one that best fit. I've always thought about it, but I never found the right design.
Yeah, I never had that problem.
Awesome. So, Michelle, before we dive into your work, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners a little background about yourself and possibly a little fun fact about yourself that maybe not a lot of people know about you?
Well, as you said before, I started tattooing in 1991 when tattooing was illegal in New York City. So I worked underground for 6 years before it was legalized, which was when we opened up Daredevil Tattoo, me and my business partner, Brad Fink. And we moved to the location that we're at now in 2013, and Brad's always been a very avid collector of antique tattoo stuff, and so we incorporated his collection into the shop as a museum. So, like, that means if anybody wants to come by Daredevil, it's like you don't have to just be getting tattooed. It's like people come by all the time just to see the collection. And I'm also a licensed New York City tour guide because modern tattooing was actually invented right down the street from our shop on the Bowery. And so I do history walks that go over to where all like this tattoo history was, like the first professional tattooer in the United States, who was listed as tattooing in the New York City Directory in 1858. Um,
Wow.
Worked just a few blocks from where our shop is, and the first electric tattoo machine was patented on the Bowery. So we happen to be in this area that, has a very rich tattoo history, and it goes back to even before the Civil War.
Wow. That is absolutely insane. So, is it safe to say that, well, tattooing has existed in every culture throughout history, what we now consider, modern tattooing originated in the US in the state of New York, it seems.
No, and not just the state of New York. Modern tattooing, like, really, began on the Lower East Side, specifically in the neighborhood that we're in. The Bowery is the oldest thoroughfare in New York City, and so the Bowery itself is this like very historic street that
Mm,
goes back to, well, it started out as a Native American footpath. And, when the Dutch settled in New York City, the Bowery was named after an old Dutch word for farm, because that area was all farmland. And so the traders and farmers and stuff would use the Bowery to bring their, cattle, down to the Collect Pond, which was down there. And so the Bowery was really like the first entertainment district in New York City. And eventually it became like the first working class entertainment district. The first theaters were on the Bowery. The dime museums were on the Bowery. And it established this, like, it had this, basically, it was world renowned, and a lot of that,
mm,
the sailing culture, which is really what tattooing came out of. It came out of the sailing culture, which was very present and prevalent in New York City. And so, like, these sailors would go around the world and they would tell people, oh, if you're going to New York, you have to go to the Bowery. And so that was the place. Like, these guys would, pull up, and they would head straight to the Bowery. That's where all the, like, taverns and, drinking and all that kind of stuff was. And it just had this, like, it was just a very intriguing place for people. And that was where the first tattooers started doing business, and I think because it's like the combination of the sailors and it being this kind of like captive audience, that was there to spend money, have fun, get in trouble.
awesome. All right. All right. So, as you mentioned earlier, Michelle, you began tattooing back in the early 1990s, and you're also a licensed tour giver in New York. So, I'm very curious. Growing up, how did those two passions come about? And then, how did you make the decision later in life to combine the two together, to combine, your passion for New York history as well as your passion for tattooing and the history of tattoos?
I mean, I got into tattoos because when I was a kid, I was, a punk, and, I would punk shows and everything. And that was actually how I met my business partner, Brad. The two of us just were, in that sort of scene. And when I'm from St. Louis, and I moved to New York in '89 for art school. And it was just, I got my first tattoo when I was in high school. And it was just something that was like very outside of the mainstream back then. And anytime, I had a chance, if I had any extra money, it's like I would go and get another tattoo. And eventually I started tattooing. And it it wasn't until a little bit later that I kind of got more involved with the history aspect of it. And what really ramped that up was, moving to where we are and deciding to have the museum, and that was what made me start. I should have grabbed a copy of my map, but when we moved down there, I thought it would be cool to research where the old Bowery tattooers were. And so I made these maps, and it's kind of crazy, like, how many tattooers were just in like these couple blocks along the Bowery. And we thought if any place should have a tattoo museum, it's definitely New York City, and definitely the Lower East Side, where we're at. And so I guess just the things kind of like fed on each other.
Nice. Now, what can you tell our viewers and listeners about the overall goal and mission of Daredevil Tattooing?
Our goal is to really to preserve that history and to make it, we really want to be a global destination for people who are interested in tattoo history and, and the importance that New York City and the Lower East Side are to that history. And that's what's really cool is that we have this collection that, people can still come in and get tattooed, off of these sheets that are, you know, many of them over 100 years old, and so it's like it literally keeps that history alive, in a very literal sense.
Nice, very nice, Michelle. Now, I did forget to mention that there will be some fan questions sprinkled throughout the interview, some I think you'll find very, very fascinating. And as a first little icebreaker fan question, when you got into the business of tattooing, what really surprised you about the industry that you didn't know of at the time?
I think what surprised me about it was, I think it was just, it was very challenging, technically, and I should put some water. It surprised me, like, how many years I worked that, like, pretty much, um, I was my worst critic, with tattoos. And, people always ask, they're like, "Oh, have you ever, made a mistake or anything?" And I always say there's not a tattoo I've ever done that I couldn't look at and see something that I could have done better or maybe should have done differently. And so, to me, that's just like it's part of being an artist. It's like you're going to see
Mhm.
in a completely different way than the customer sees things. And so I think that was probably, the hardest thing was just like kind of trying to like square, what would make me happy with my work and, and where it actually was in reality.
Absolutely, very, very true. And another fan question, which I was actually really happy to have you on the show because I think this one is very perfect, and one that I've seen a lot on the interwebs. And this viewer asks, or it's a comment, I should say. They say that art, as we know it, reflects culture. As a tattooer and a historian, do you think that is also the same for tattooing itself?
Yeah, I think definitely. What is interesting to me about tattooing is that, it's this very kind of working class art, and it's something that has this very working class and outsider background to it. And so I think you know, especially just like with tattoos, like it reflects like how, for me, it came out of like, the punk rock scene and everything. And, and you
Hmm.
have these, like groups of people that were always kind of historically related to tattooing. And especially with historically, it's like you had that whole like sailor culture, and
Oh, yes.
and those guys were, the ultimate outsiders. That was like, they were these rough and tumble adventurers, that had tattooing was a part of their language. Not only was it a means of self-expression, but it was also, they were talismans to protect them, and they were also things to remind them of home. And so it just goes in so many different directions, which I find, really fascinating.
Nice. And also, still with that same mindset, how would one examine an old tattoo from your book that you showed about an example of the Statue of Liberty? How could we as historians use those old tattoos of the Statue of Liberty as a window and as a tool to understand the history that it's presenting?
Well, one thing that I thought was really interesting about, kind of digging deep on Lady Liberty is that it's kind of cool that she sort of like has these like, to me, like three different sort of like interpretations. On the one hand, she's representative of our country, but then on the other hand, she's representative of our city. And then for other people, she's representative of just the very idea of liberty. And I think it's like,
Hmm.
pretty cool that you can bring like these different interpretations, and different people will want to get her for different reasons.
Absolutely.
Not sure if I strayed away from your question there.
Oh no, that actually that makes sense. I also what I'm really fascinated by are the different designs that Lady Liberty has gone through over the years and how many people interpreted her differently over the years. And do you also think, like artwork, art definitely changes with time, different styles, new techniques come about. Have you noticed that's similar with the tattoo industry? When looking at old tattoos from the past, and as time has gone on, and of course, the technology has improved to modern tattoos of the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been like a real evolution. I think at this point, anything goes, but
Hmm.
one thing that was real striking to me in relation to, classic like Americana tattoos is when I first started tattooing in the early 90s, you couldn't really give away traditional tattoos, and nobody was interested in that. And we actually used to have
Mm.
a few sheets that were hanging up in our original location on Ludlow Street. And people would come in and they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, does anyone ever get that stuff?" They were like, thought it was almost like a joke for us to have like traditional designs on the wall. They were like, "Oh, it looks like something my grandpa would have in the Navy." And it's been really interesting to see how people started to become like more hip to, Americana, American tattooing, in that tradition. And they started to see the charm in it. I think like in the 90s, people went through this period where it's like they really wanted everything to be very like individualistic and everything.
Mm.
And then it kind of came back around to people seeing that, like, wow, these traditional American designs, are so iconic and they're so timeless. And it doesn't have to have that like really super personal vision in it. Like it's these designs exist on their own and they have this like universal appeal. And there's a reason why they've been around for so long. And so everything has kind of come back around to people, really enjoying traditional American tattoos, which is great.
Nice. And as a historian and owner of Daredevil, what's been the most fascinating piece in your guys' collection that has a very rich history behind it?
One of my favorite pieces in the collection is actually a newspaper article. I wish I could show you a picture of it. It's like a full page article, and it's from 1901, and it's about this famous New York socialite who was tattooed by Samuel O'Reilly, who was the inventor of the electric tattoo machine. And her name was Amy Gillig, and she was a real character. She inherited $10 million when she was 10 years old. She traveled all over the world. She was a really into the throwing these like elaborate soirees, and she was into seances. She had a 10-year affair with Aleister Crowley.
Wow.
She was married 5 different times in 5 different decades of her life, and all of her husbands were in their 20s. And she got a bunch of tattoos, and she even had she had a snake tattoo that wrapped all the way around her arm because she was also a snake handler. And so I really love this article that we have because it's like you have kind of this combination of this aristocratic woman who was just incredibly wealthy for the time period. And, and she was all tattooed up. And then also that this piece is on newsprint, it's like so delicate, has these like crazy illustrations as part of it. And so that's, that piece, I really love that we have that.
Nice. And another fan question from one of my viewers asked, we know tattoos are synonymous with cultures and subcultures and certain eras. In your opinion, are there any tattoos that are specifically centered on a period in American history, i.e., 50s, 60s, the punk culture, the rock culture, hippie culture, etc.?
I think after World War I and World War II, there was, you had all of those military tattoos that were being done. So they're like very emblematic of the time, especially, you can tell the age of some of the artwork by what some of the uniforms that they might be depicted as wearing on some of these designs. And so that was also like a really prevalent thing, was the effect that like the world wars had on tattooing. So that's probably one thing that's like very specifically tied to tattooing
Mm,
in certain eras.
definitely. And we also see that a lot in the old Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons. Is a lot of sometimes the characters will have like the Singapore tattoo with either like a woman's name, a heart. So that has also been ingrained heavily in our culture as well. And it's always very fascinating that I never really took that into consideration, because like, oh, well, of course, those tattoos exist because, it's wartime. You always see that. And you have like the classic, those designs on like the shoulder and stuff like that. But tattooing in of itself has definitely changed over the years to reflect, the times, the message, culture, of course. Tattooing also has a lot of symbolism and meaning behind it. Sometimes, going outside of the United States, you have other cultures that have their own versions of tattooing that are very ceremonial. And sometimes tattooers from other parts of the world take that inspiration and put it into their own style of tattooing. And with that said, Michelle, this is another fan question. In your career as a tattooer, what has been your favorite tattoo to work on, as well as the most complex or difficult tattoo to work on?
Um, I love doing large scale stuff. I have like a few different back pieces I've done that, when I started tattooing, it's like you did everything. I think nowadays there's been a real shift with social media, is that people like really curate their work towards their Instagram page. And
Mm,
and that's just not something that I really came up with, and so like um, you know, I'll do a lot of different styles that come my way, and my favorite thing is when somebody kind of just gives me a concept and kind of lets me run with it, like, but I have a couple back pieces that got very, deep in the weeds with like, details and,
mm.
different, sort of symbolism behind it and stuff like that. But yeah, I'd say most all the back pieces I've done have been my favorite ones.
And would you also say that there also have been some of the most difficult ones, depending on the designs too?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And then again, I'm my worst critic, so it's like having to come up with something that I'm happy with to present to the customer is always, for me, challenging.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now take a little detour outside of tattooing, and now your work as a tourist guide in New York, talking about the history. How did that come about, and where have been some of your favorite places to take tours to discuss the history of New York?
Well, I always take them to the same place. My tour is just very specialized. It's just the Bowery Tattoo History Tour.
Mm,
But really, it came about because of that map that I mentioned before.
mhm,
When I drew that map, when we first moved to Division Street, where we're at, um, when we first had the idea to launch the museum, we did a Kickstarter for it. And, we did really good. I think we raised like over $35,000. And we, I, I had made these maps, and I thought, oh, it'd be kind of cool if I did like a tour for like our biggest supporters in the Kickstarters, like one of the rewards. And so that was when it first occurred to me to like do, the walking tour. And then when we had our 20th anniversary party, which was around when we moved to that space, I thought it'd be fun to take all of the tattooers that visited on the tour. And I just had more and more people who were like, oh, I want to do your tour. And so, if I figured when I took all those tattooers, it was like 25 tattooers, and I was like, oh, I better get, my license if I be dragging 25 tattooers up the Bowery on this walking tour. And I really enjoyed getting the license. It's actually really hard. It's like took 6 months to study for it, and it's like I think like a 2-hour test, with like 100 and like 25 questions or something.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you get like over 120, you get like a little star next to your name. So like I got the little star and people are like, oh, that's so, it's a really hard test. But I'm like, yeah, but if you like history, then it's fun, and I still to this day, if I'm going around the city and, I come across something that was like on the test, I check it out, and in my studying, I went all around the city to the different, places that I knew were going to be on the test. And it's fun to expand your knowledge and to have like, to put stuff in context is always, really interesting to me.
Very true. Very, very true. And this leads into what I call a few reflective questions. And I'll give some context for all of these. So for the first one, I always like talking with my guests about, especially independent and small businesses and, either local or freelance individuals as historians, authors, creators, and so forth, is that it is not easy being an indie or a small business in the pool or in the tidal wave of towering industries. We are passionate about so many things and love showcasing our talents and our passions to a wide range. But just like in everything, the industry has changed. And almost like you talked a little bit about, Michelle, with social media, how that has also impacted the tattooing industry. That has also changed the way, things have gone, especially for history and everything in general. Because many years ago, if someone wanted to leave a review of like a tattoo they got or a place they went to, that was all about word of mouth or an actual written review that was either posted somewhere, and only like a select few would actually see it. But now with social media, it is insane. Yes, for everything, it allows us to reach out to new people. It allows us to interact with fans. I'm sure you were able to get a lot of great feedback from people who have gone on the tours and who have said that they've enjoyed it, absolutely loved it, and that's amazing. But social media is a double-edged sword. It leaves ourselves exposed to a lot of the negativity and drawbacks that come behind it. And especially, I've talked a lot of this about with other historians on this topic, is this sort of conflict between the classically trained historians and those who have to call the indie historians, the freelance historians, those that are either historical content creators, armchair historians, historians that are tour guides, so forth. There's kind of like this tension between like who can call themselves a historian if you're not classically trained. And of course, that's also seen on social media. But I digress. With all that said and more, Michelle, what still disciplines you to continue doing what you love, which is, talking about tattoos, showcasing the history of tattoos, and just making history fun in a different way?
Wait, so the question part of that is, how do I make it fun?
So ultimately, the question is, Michelle, with all the drawbacks of social media and being an independent historian in the digital age, what does still discipline you to still do what you're doing uh down this path of yours from when you first got started back in the 90s?
I mean, it's like I can't really imagine any other job outside of tattooing. It's just tattooing is pretty much my whole identity. And and I definitely feel like that I wish that I was a classically trained historian, and I'm definitely, I'm a little jealous of librarians, because it's
Mhm.
like I was trained with that, when I get stuck like on my research and stuff. Um, but I think right now I'm working on another book that's about like the history of tattooing in New York City. And as a small business owner, it's like I always would say that, I'd be a better tattooer if I wasn't a business owner, and I'd be a better business
Mm,
if I wasn't a tattooer. And I kind of feel the same thing like with, just the work I'm doing, with the history that I focus on is like, oh, I'd be a better historian if I wasn't, spending all my time drawing for tattoos. And I'd be a better tattooer if I didn't have like all these other things like outside of tattooing that I have to, attend to.
right.
And
Very true.
yeah, but it's like, as far as what keeps me going, I mean, I love it, and I just, the deeper I get into the history and everything, the more you put things into context, the more it brings it alive, and it becomes, more and more interesting to me. And, it was really fun to make the maps that I was talking about, because even people who know like a lot about New York City tattoo history, or just a lot of people who know a lot about tattoo history, were shocked to see how many tattooers were in that little, those couple of blocks on the Bowery. And so that was, really gratifying, that nobody had ever like put that together and, and assembled like, how many people were, in those couple of blocks right there.
Mm, all right. All right. Now, this one, I am very intrigued to hear your thoughts on, Michelle, because I definitely think it may or may not impact your guys' industry, but I'm very curious if it has trickled in, and that is, of course, AI. Now, AI is always going to be with us in every capacity, but generative AI is the main one I really want to hear your insights on, because generative AI, when people use it, it does take from already published images from a lot of other artists around the world. And I'm very curious if you may have come across that in your line of work, either if a client has brought in a design that you knew was based on an AI prompt or was made from AI, but the design is probably taken from another tattoo or existing tattoo that has already been done.
I mean, we've always had the whole thing where it's like people bring stuff in from other sources. And in the 90s, people brought in tattoo magazines and they were like, I want to get this tattoo, and meanwhile it's on another person, and so that's always been something that we've kind of contended with. Our standard sort of answer is usually like, if somebody shows us something, it's like, oh, cool, can I redraw that? And then you take it and make it your own thing. So the AI thing like is almost not really new for us. As far as like people bringing stuff in that they've referenced from other places. Uh, and I don't think like with the style of tattooing that I do, it is really much of a conflict, really. But it is kind of funny that I have, seen like, some people like reproduce things that, were kind of inaccurate, that were from AI. I mean, honestly, it's like social media and Instagram have had more of an impact on tattooing than I'd say AI has at all, because I think social media has made tattoo shops a little bit maybe less relevant, because it used to be tattooers would kind of need to stay put in a shop in order to like get business, and now people can really just establish a social media following, and they don't really need the shops as much. But that kind of like had an effect when a lot of artists started working in more like private studios. But I think it seems now there's kind of like this return to people appreciating the dynamic of a tattoo shop. And and like at our shop at Daredevil, it's like we have a really great team, and it's a really nice vibe in the shop, and a lot of people are, really want to be a part of that, and I think that tattoo shops are starting now. There is like people are coming back around to appreciating the social nature of a tattoo shop, and I think like it's like, we keep hearing about people are more and more isolated because of social media and AI friends and stuff like that. That I think people are coming back around to like wanting to have these, what do they people call them, like third spaces or something? Is that like a term, like these other places outside your home where you can kind of congregate with like-minded people? And so I think that our shop kind of functions in that way, which is, really gratifying to have created something that, people like to be a part of, and, and it's important to them, not just me, the business owner.
A little pause right here so I know when to stop. Okay. So, Michelle, now let's focus on the business side of the industry, which I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on. And you may have already hinted it in the beginning, but I am very curious. Looking back on your career as a tattooer and business owner, is there anything you would have done differently in terms of marketing Daredevil or marketing your services as a tattooer?
Um, I don't know what I would have done differently. I mean, maybe I would have, I don't know, found a business partner that wasn't so much like myself. I mean, both of us are like, we're both artists, and we're both, just really into all the history, the craft of tattooing, and both of us are kind of terrible at all the business stuff. And so I'm a little bit jealous when I see people that, it's like a tattooer and their business partners with someone who actually is good at business, and that's
Right.
I had somebody say to me the other day, I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be our 30th anniversary in, 2027. They're like, oh my God, that's so cool. And I was like, yeah, it sucks, because I love my shop, but I hate all the business part of it. It's like,
Mm,
I want to just like show up, do tattoos, hang out with the other artists, and, do research on tattoos and talk about tattoos and draw tattoos. But all the other stuff I absolutely despise.
absolutely, 100%. Now, on the business of creating tattoos, this is another question. It's also, in a way, a fan question, almost like with illustrators and illustration, because tattooing is illustration in and of itself. There's this balance of showcasing the individuality of the artist, but also understanding the expectations of the client in the case of if you're doing a commission, so to speak. Let's say your commission has to be a specific design or expectation. It's that fine line. How do you balance the two, showcasing your individuality, but also meeting the client's expectations? And for you, Michelle, is there an example that you can share with us that really highlights who you are as a tattooer that separates you from others in the industry?
I mean, I think I mentioned before, it's like I feel like the time I started tattooing, I think I'm kind of different than a lot of tattooers out there in that I'm not that great about curating stuff to my Instagram feed, which probably is not the best thing for me as far as like business wise, because people really seem to like seeing like a well curated Instagram feed, but it's like
Mm.
I really enjoy like doing all different stuff, and and so I've never really developed like a very specific like style that contains what I do. But yeah, I think wait, can you say the question again? I got lost there for a minute.
Of course, of course. So the question was, in your career as a tattooer, is there one design that you worked on, may have been a one time, or maybe it was over a series of sessions, that really highlights this balance of your individuality as a tattooer, but also the expectations of the client.
Well, actually, yeah, recently, I drew something up for a client, and I had kind of had the same scenario with this client like a while ago. And, and this guy, kind of like what you were talking about with the AI thing, it's like he'll send me a picture of somebody else's tattoo, and he's like, that's what I want. I want it just like that. And so for me, it's like always kind of trying to take that and make it my own and convince this guy that, like, hey, I don't want to do this other person's tattoo. And it's like, all the stuff I've done a lot of work for this guy, and he like clearly likes my work. I've done both his arms and everything. And yet I always kind of have this like back and forth with him to try to like, get him away from like, when he falls in love with like some image that's from somebody else. And to make it even worse, like usually it's a tattoo that's like really big and he wants to get it like, really small. And, on top of that, and so, yeah, there always is this like back and forth to make stuff that's something that I want to do and something that I'm interested in.
Nice. Okay. All right. Now, this one is another fan question. I think we may have already covered this before, but maybe we can look at it at another angle, which is, in your opinion, Michelle, as a tattooer and as an historian, do you believe that history creates the tattoo, or do you believe tattoo creates the history?
Um, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think tattoos are just like this reflection of things that people want to express about themselves,
Mm,
more than like any sort of like more so than historical context. I mean, I think that there was more historical context when you had like, like you mentioned before, the wartime tattoos. I think tattoos come out of more of a cultural, like individualistic, sort of like representation than, a lot of, I mean, although there are plenty of people that get stuff for like external, like sports teams or, things like that. But yeah, I think it's just tattooing something that's, very personal that, maybe you don't get like with other means of it, like uh, things that people do.
absolutely. Absolutely. And this actually is another fan question, which actually I'm very intrigued by. This viewer, or say, viewer asks, we always have assumed that tattooing is a more modern creation in recent history in the 20th century. But, and this person also, I want to say, had a chance to look at, old previous tattoos before this recording. They've looked at, tattoos from, the 1800s, kind of around the same time period that you were looking at for the Statue of Liberties. Why is it that in history we don't get told that tattooing existed a lot earlier than what we conceive to be the earliest history of tattooing, which again, some people assume it's the 20th century as opposed to the 19th century?
I mean, I think people are pretty aware of, just the sort of global history of tattooing and, and how it predates, like our country or, European culture. I mean, pretty much every culture going back as far as we can go back has had tattooing. I mean, they found like, Otzi the Iceman was frozen
Yes.
frozen in the Alps, and they found Egyptian mummies with tattoos and stuff. And I think maybe people aren't aware of like the early like European history of tattooing. I mean, there was kind of like this misconception for a while that Captain Cook kind of discovered tattooing. He was in the Polynesian Islands, and that's been refuted because, they've found, there's evidence of sailors getting tattooed like well before Captain Cook's voyage. And so that misconception has kind of been turned around, because, going back to like Mutiny on the Bounty, it's like
Yes.
they identified the mutineers by their tattoos, and back when they would sign people up for, the sailors and stuff, they would identify them by their tattoos. And,
Mm,
we have these records that, this stuff goes back as far as we have records of it going back, and you have the early Christian, the uh, Coptic Christian. I don't know much about that stuff, but like the Coptic Christians getting tattooed, and the Picts getting tattooed, and
yes.
so it's a very rich history that spans pretty much every culture, and definitely not just a 20th century thing.
Absolutely, very true. And I think it's ultimately, I talked about this with a lot of people on the show, is that history is not black and white in terms of, the sub histories and the sub fields. The history is ever encompassing. And you could make the argument that tattooing has also its ties to war paint, or definitely face paint, and, the history and the symbolism behind that in of itself. But you're absolutely right, Michelle, that tattooing has existed in all different cultures, and it's taken on different meanings over time. And it has taken on new life, especially, with new eras, new movements, and stuff like that. It is very, very fascinating to see and really, really explore and talk about. So let's imagine a little hypothetical scenario as we're nearing the end of this amazing interview, Michelle. Let's say you've been invited to host a speaking seminar at a local university in your area. And it is about tattoos in history. It's a very, very broad subject. Now, with that topic, what is the one thing that you would like to tell people, this classroom of students, colleges, or just people who have an interest in history, about the history of tattoos?
I mean, I'm biased. I always go back to, the Bowery, just because that's, that's my specialty, and that's also where I live, and so I always kind of go back around to that, and one thing that I think is really interesting, I like to mention, is that just from the research I've done, I've found articles pretty much every decade going back to the late 1800s, where they're saying that tattooing is the latest trend. And
Mm,
I found all these headlines, like the not just for bikers and sailors anymore,
right.
going back to, like I said, the late 1800s. And I can't think of any other um thing that like has been a trend for like 150 years.
That's
uh,
true.
And you? I mean, it's like, and it's just wild that, like, we always keep coming back around to this thing of tattooing being the latest thing and the latest craze. And, so I think it's interesting that it actually has been something that's been, a part of our culture, and pretty much every other culture, and universally. And it's just, yeah, interesting to me that, it has that place that is so unique to it, that I can't think of another thing that has that universal history to it.
Absolutely. And before we get to the final two questions, Michelle, here's the final fan question. What is the biggest stereotype or myth surrounding tattooing that just won't die?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I guess, it still has, I don't know. I mean, I think most of the myths have kind of died, but I don't think that's like a necessarily a good thing. The myth used to be that tattoos were for, criminals, and, you know,
Mhm.
bikers and sailors and all these like sort of undesirable elements of society. But to me, that was part of the fun, was that it had that like, edge to it. It's like I didn't get into tattoos because they were popular. And so I was kind of okay with, it being this like underground outlaw art form. And so to me, it's kind of a little bit sad that some of the most, stereotypical myths have gone away. I don't know that any of those myths like really stick anymore, based on how mainstream it is, for better or worse, just like my neighborhood, the Lower East Side. Both things have grown up together, on these parallel tracks, and both have gentrified together for better or for worse.
Hmm. All right. All right. Now, as we near the end of this incredible discussion, Michelle, we now arrive at the final two questions when we're going to combine together. From our discussion, we talked about a lot of incredible things, from your background as a tattoo artist from the early 90s, creating Daredevil tattooing, the museum, the mission you have behind it, you as a tour guide showcasing the Bowery District, Lower East Side, the history of tattooing that's ingrained in the Bowery District, and all of that good stuff. At the end of the day, what do you want people to take away from our discussion and your background as a tattooer, a business owner, and an historian? And finally, what is your word of wisdom to other people who want to combine their passion for history with another one of their passions?
I think people's takeaway from today, I think that they should come to New York, visit the shop, and get tattooed. Um, I think that's the takeaway. Hit me up for your next tattoo. And the second part, remind me, what's the second part?
Oh, yes. What is your word of wisdom to others who want to take their passion for history and combine it with another passion of theirs?
I think it's like, you just start like really digging deep, and just see where all the little like, where it takes you. Like for me, it was just, to find like these little threads that led off into other directions, just really helped to like tell that story, like the first professional tattooer in the United States, Martin Hildebrand, that I mentioned before,
Hmm.
he was the one who was listed in the city directory in 1858. The old interviews with him, he said that he worked on the SS United States. He served on that in the US Navy. And so I looked up the SS United States, and it turns out that's the same ship that Herman Melville served on 2 years before Hildebrand. And so I think it's just really interesting to, dig deep and to find these connections to like other things, and just to let it take you where it takes you.
Beautifully said, Michelle. Beautifully said. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing historians interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Michelle, for coming on the show, making her official debut here on the channel, and hopefully not the last time. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find and engage with you on social media if they want to reach out? And for all my fans in New York, where can they find Daredevil Tattooing if they want to get their own tattoo or learn a little bit more about the history of tattooing?
Well, our shop is down on Division Street on the Lower East Side. It's 141 Division, and it's kind of Canal Street between Ludlow and Essex. We're sort of on the edge of Chinatown. It's a really fun place to visit just in general. I always tell people if they're coming to New York, they should stay by our shop because we're in the fun part of town. Don't stay in Times Square. And our website is daredeviltattoo.com. My Instagram is Daredevil Michelle. The shop Instagram is Daredevil Tattoo. And if anyone wants to go on my walking tour, I book them through Airbnb Experiences, there's a link on my Instagram to that, or on our website.
Awesome. I will link all that down below in the description of this video, viewers and listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode again here on the show. A huge thank you to Michelle for coming on the show, making her official debut. And if you'd like to see Michelle back on the show for either a follow up interview or possibly being part of season 4 of the Historians Lounge, like, comment, and subscribe down below on this video and on this channel. And until next time, viewers and listeners, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. Signing out, wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you all in the next episode.